delighted that we are back on. And it was a lovely summer where I went nowhere apart from Wicklow. That's about our drive. And ended up spending all my holiday doing some kids activities, going to kids playground and all that stuff.
Lucky.
No, just meaning sitting and waiting for kids to come back. But anyway, all them little whatever. Yeah. But the weather was nice. It was okay. Sorry, that's my dog doing about. Anyway, so delighted that we're back, and I'm absolutely delighted that we have Billy and Tony this week presenting to kick off our new beginning of research. What is this group called? Relevance Researchers Network. Long day. Right. So people still joining. So while we do that, I am going to do some plug-in. So upcoming events. We are starting with today Billy and Tony talking about pragmatics and writing. Next month in October, Kate Scott will be presenting relevance and communication design. It's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be very interesting. And in November, we have Pauline, who has recently started a new job. Congratulations, Pauline. Excellent news. And she will give us a talk based on her PhD, which you finished last year, sometime last year, I suppose.
Yeah, I did.
So wonderful 2020 and 2021 for you. That's quite rare, we can say that. So well done, Pauline. Okay.
Thank you.
So without I don't think you want to listen to me too long anyway, so I will pass on to Billy and Tony today. And maybe, do you want to start with sharing slide or?
Yeah, I think so.
I think have I made it so that you should be able to share now, I think.
Oh yeah, it's coming. I'm just getting to the right place.
Yeah, and to let you know that the whole session will be recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. You know what? We're a YouTuber now. We've got our YouTube channel. So all the previous talks, when I didn't forget to record, is there from our website again. Have you said that? Did we record? Yes, thank you.
It is recording, yeah.
Yes. Okay, so Billy and Tony, floor's yours.
Thank you very much. So Tony and I had a chat about it, and we decided that we wanted this to feel more like a conversation than a presentation. So I'm hoping you're all just going to blather away at once rather than me sitting here talking and every now and then you speak. And we also said that I would basically start talking and Tony would chip in just like the rest of you. Whenever Tony feels like saying something, he'll say something. And we'd be really happy if the rest of you just join in anytime. You don't have to click a hand reaction or anything. Just start speaking whenever you want to. Okay, so the reason that book cover's on the front slide is because we're going to talk about that in a minute. And I thought I'd just start with a pragmatic example for you, which is, this. I don't know if any of you have heard of the concept, ask for the and. It's not really got much to do with this talk, but it is an example of writing and communicating. So I listen a lot to this podcast, Mark Kermode, the guy on the right, and Simon Mayo, the guy on the left, talking about film. And one time they were talking to Tom Wilkinson about film credits. And he told them that one time he was working on a film and they were debating how the credits would go. And his agent said to him, ask for the and. So it's meaningful if you're on the credits and it says, and Tom Wilkinson, rather than just having another name. And also with. So that's quite a nice example that you can talk about in class as well. And it also occurred to me to mention it because when Tony and I are talking together, we have to decide whose name goes where on the first slide. And there is a famous example, I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but the film The Towering Inferno, which came out, I think it's the 1970s, a very long time ago. And at the time, Steve McQueen and Paul Newman were two of the biggest film stars in the world. And the story goes...
Billy, sorry, can you, are we talking about slide 3?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we're still on the page first slide.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they haven't moved along.
It says sharing is paused. Hang on, how do I do this? You're still not seeing it?
We can see your
we can
screen.
see your the sort of background screen, so we're not seeing
It says,
presenting.
bring your shared window to the front. So I think, I don't know what that means. Has anybody done this before? We get a little orange line saying sharing is paused. Bring your shared, is it now?
Something's happening.
It just still says you are viewing Billy Clark's screen, but it's.
But we can see the whole of the slides on the side, and it's not moving on.
Left panels and the right.
Maybe I'll start sharing again.
Yeah, I think so.
What
And
happened?
she's
So I literally do not understand what's happening. So if I click share, do you see ask for the and?
Yeah.
that's it. Yeah,
Yeah, we got it now.
perfect.
And now do you see the first slide?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do.
Thank you. Okay, so you'll see that I've put myself to the right and Tony underneath on this slide.
Yeah.
This was the ask for the and thing. So you never saw that before, but you can look at it later. I think you got the idea from what I said. And then this is the poster for the Tyrant Inferno. So when this film came out, yeah, Paul Newman and Steve McQueen were two of the biggest actors in the world. And each of their agents wanted them to get top billing. And so there was a debate about what to do. And what they decided was Steve McQueen will be more to the left and Paul Newman will be higher. And that was the compromise. So if you look at it from left to right, you'll see Steve McQueen first. And if you look at it from top to bottom, you see Paul Newman first. And I only spotted when I looked at this poster today that every time I've heard that story, nobody has mentioned that Faye Dunaway, who's one of the biggest actors ever, is a bit lower down than all the guys, which is just a little bit shocking. Anyway, so that's the compromise Tony and I have come up with this time.
I think today it's Billy Clark with Tony Williams, isn't it? You've got the. I think
You've
you're
asked-
the main.
You've asked for the width, but I haven't given it to you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get on to what we're meant to be talking about. So I wanted to start just to make sure that you do all start talking, just by asking you to say any thoughts or questions you have about the pragmatics of writing. So you're coming to a talk about pragmatics in writing. Is there anything you're thinking about pragmatics in writing, or any questions you've got about pragmatics in writing? What do you think?
I guess my biggest issue around writing is always who is the audience. So when you're speaking to somebody, you know who your hearer is, generally, not always, but usually. But when you're writing, you don't know when or where or who your words will be interpreted. So that invisible audience.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anybody got any other thoughts? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I've got a few prods I could give to suggest other things.
I just wrote in the chat, I think it's the opposite of what Kate was saying about the audience. I'm thinking about the author and the self-representation of the author in writing.
Okay. So you think that it's different in writing from other things, you mean?
Yeah, and there are different ways to represent yourself in the writing as well.
That's really interesting. I'm taking a lot of notes here because these are things we should definitely be thinking about.
Adam, you were waving. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was thinking kind of the reverse of what Kate was saying as well. What about questions about authorial intentions and how they fit with communicative intentions? In particular, when you've got things like joint authorship, and stochastic writing, like Bowie's cut-up lyrics and stuff that's generated by computers, and it's almost as if it kind of doesn't matter if there's a real author or real intentions. And I'm just wondering, what have you kind of what have your thoughts been about that issue of how you relate relevancy and communicative intentions to the interpretation of writing?
I mean, that one is something that we are going to come on to, because one of the first things that Tony and I have spoken about is questions about intentionality, how clear intentions are when writers are doing their writing.
Yeah.
The other thing, Sorry, did you want to come back?
So yeah, I was just going to. I think that's a really interesting question, Adam. And I suppose one of the first things we might think about is even when somebody's doing cut-ups, for example, they have an intentionality, but it's about a process or a practice. So
Yeah.
I guess there's that question, isn't there, about is artistic production different from a more kind of straightforward kind of communication?
Yeah.
I think Billy's probably thinking, why has he said it's more straightforward? All communication is complicated, but for me, I kind of think about literary production as being complex. But yeah, we'll come on to that.
Brilliant.
There's one other thing I'll throw in before we carry on, because I've just been introducing Grice to some students. And one of the things I said to them is, people talk about Grice's theory of conversation, but A, it's not a theory, and B, it's not of conversation. And of course, conversation suggests speaking. And I'm sure most people have introduced Grice to people point out, he talks about a letter, a reference letter for a philosophy job. So he clearly thinks pragmatics applies to writing just as much as it does to speaking. So in some ways, we expect our pragmatic theories to account for writing, but in other ways, we've got reasons for thinking that there's something different about writing. And yeah, I mean, Tony has already suggested, I don't think it's as different as some people might think it is. So we'll see. Oops. Has that moved on for you? Okay, good. So some of the questions we're asking are, what can ideas from pragmatics tell us about the practice or practices of writers? And that includes about writing and rewriting practice, but also about teaching, including teaching writing, and including teaching creative writing, as well as other kinds of writing, and also about reflecting on writing. Don't worry, I'm not going to speak about all these things right now, but these are things that are questions that we're interested in. And Tony has actually written some research talking about how writers reflect on writing. And some of you will know that as part of things like the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, creative writers have to talk about what they were doing. They have to reflect on it if they want their writing to feature in the research exercise. And that can be quite challenging sometimes.
And I guess just to say, we have to do it for the ref, but obviously there's a hope that it is actually a useful thing to do, you know. So I suppose one of the things that I think about quite a lot is how can we make that reflection process useful as opposed to just being a kind of rubber stamping, which is, I suppose, one of the reasons for my kind of involvement here. Yeah, I'll stop there. I was going to say, I was going to feel myself launching off into a different topic, but I'll stop and let you.
That's interesting. And also we know that different people have different attitudes to writing those reflective pieces. And some of them do think about it as, it's just a tick box. I don't want to do it, but I have to. And others like you are thinking, how's it going to be useful? Just to say, I hope somebody else looks at the chat, because I'm not capable of scanning the chat while I'm blethering away. So if anything comes up that you think is important for me to respond to, just say. Okay, so Tony and I are hoping to develop understanding of the pragmatics of production. So one of my interests in writing is because it's an example of production. And Kyuhyun Park, who is here today, is working on a PhD on this topic at the minute, thinking about proposing that there might be a heuristic for production like there is for comprehension, and looking at some empirical data that shows how people change what they say and how they act depending on who their audience is. So that kind of connects with us. And yeah, we're interested in applying ideas from pragmatics, and we're interested in writing practice and ways of talking about writing practice. And I've just realized that's kind of saying some of the same stuff I just said a minute ago, but hey, we're having a conversation, so it's not a written up paper. And what we're doing, I would say, Tony and I have been having a conversation really. And I mean, this is interdisciplinary work. And I think we've really been trying to have the kind of conversation where we look at what our different perspectives suggest, and we think about how much difference or overlap there is. And we're trying not to have it be too much like one of us says, oh, I think such and such. So I'm not sure your theory is quite right. And the other one goes, oh, but you've missed it, it's this. And then we end up just talking at cross purposes and not getting anywhere. So we're trying to have a kind of constructive conversation where we share what we are thinking and see how many connections there are from the different perspectives. Okay, so here are some thoughts so far that people might or might not agree with. So they're deliberately vague, the first couple. Writing and speaking are not that different. Well, that depends how different somebody said they are. And what I mean by saying that is writing and speaking are acts of communication. And so I think it may be a bit like when people say, do men and women speak differently? Well, there are lots of different men and lots of different women and lots of different ways of thinking about identities. And I think the same with communicative practice. There's lots of kinds of writing, lots of kinds of speaking, and lots of kinds of things that are kind of hybrid, like email and text messaging and so on. And that I believe that creative writing is also not that different. And that, you know, things can be creative to varying degrees. And so maybe we might say different kinds of creative writing differ from each other more than some cases of non-creative and creative writing. We think that communication involves some kind of mind modeling or reading. I'm never really happy with the exact words we use, but thinking about each other's minds is definitely going on, whether you're the communicator or the interpreter. We think that's happening. And then we have a lot of questions about different types of practice and different types of inference. Okay, I got a couple of slides in here, partly because Tony and I spoke at a symposium on applied stylistics recently. And I like to throw in a slide about pragmatic stylistics now and then. I don't know how much people think about stylistics, those of you who are here today, but every opportunity I have, I use this kind of phrasing to say that pragmatic stylistics is about applying ideas from pragmatics in accounting for the production, interpretation, and evaluation of texts. And the reason I like to use that phrasing is because a lot of people thinking about stylistics tend to focus on interpretation and tend to focus on literary texts. And most stylisticians think that stylistics is about production, interpretation, and evaluation, and also that it's not just about literary texts. But I don't think you can emphasize it too much. If you go to a stylistics conference, you'll get paper after paper on the interpretation of literary texts. So I just want to stress pragmatic stylistics goes beyond that. And of course, we're talking about production here today. Okay, and we're applying ideas from pragmatics, or aiming to apply ideas from pragmatics in developing writers' practice and teaching. And we're applying ideas from creative writing in developing pragmatics. So we're hoping that these things are going in both directions, so that writing practice and teaching can develop because of what pragmatics has to contribute, but also thinking about what creative writers think about their writing will help us to understand, to develop our theories of pragmatics. Okay, so making a start. What we're kind of starting with is thinking about what do writers say about their writing? So there were all those questions in the earlier slide, but what we're starting with is, let's look at what writers say when they're talking about writing and see how pragmatics might relate to that. And I've got a couple of slides here that Tony made for our earlier presentation. So here are some texts that have to do with writers talking about writing. So there's a journal on the practice and theory of creative writing. And there's a nice example here of who gets the credit where, because we've got a book that's edited by Kroll and Harper and a book that's edited by Harper and Kroll. So we know that if I get the alphabet right, Kroll is getting more credit for the first one, but Harper and Kroll might equally be getting credit for the second one. We don't know because of the way the alphabet works. But
I was just going to say it's worth noting as well, New Writing, the one on the left, that journal is edited by Harper, although it doesn't give him any credit on the front.
Okay, thanks. So, and then one of the things that Tony has picked up on in our earlier presentation is this idea that Harper says here, when we speak about creative writing, we're sometimes speaking about two things, the activity of creative writing and the finished works that emerge from the activities of creative writing. So, you know, the word writing is ambiguous between those two senses. And actually, I think speaking is ambiguous, but we hardly ever use speaking for the product. We use speech more often for that. So there's less likelihood of confusion. But what that takes us to is product versus process. So again, this is one of Tony's slides. So we can think about writing as a text or a product, or as an activity or a process. And also we can think about a different thing, but writing as a sort of analytical, intentional thing, or a more emotional, intuitive thing, which I'm going to say something else about in a sec.
just before you do, Billy, just that thing on the kind of product and process, I suppose that matters, I guess, for because it starts to hint at the kind of complexity of when we talk about writing. When we're being literary critics or stylistics people, we tend to be talking about the text, you know, kind of product which has been produced. When we're talking about writing, often writers are talking about their kind of activity or the process, and that seems like a really obvious distinction in some ways, but actually the way we do it might be really important. The way, for example, that when we talk about how a text works, we talk about it as sometimes as if it's a kind of mechanical thing, you know, the kind of new criticism where we're saying, look, this is what's happening in the text. And it's easy to kind of retrofit that and suggest that there's a kind of deliberative, all-seeing author deciding these things. Whereas when we talk about practice with writers, what we tend to find is often they kind of don't know what the hell they're doing, but they're completely at ease with that, and with being kind of intuitive and so on. That's the next distinction shows. So that's really important. Obviously, we're talking about what's the kind of pragmatics of production. Well, what are we kind of focusing on when we think about writing there? Are we thinking about a kind of what the writer's actually doing, or are we talking about a kind of the process that led to that text, or the way that we might read that text?
Yeah. Thanks. It also connects with something that I haven't got on any of the slides, but it's in my mind, is the difference between editing and first drafting. And it may be that some of the practice of writers is more easily affected by pragmatics when it comes to revising rather than earlier stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And just looking, Ryoko's got a question in the chat. How do you define creative writing? That's a really good question, and I'm not sure how we would do it. I mean, it's kind of, we can do it in institutional terms, in terms of kind of disciplines and what would count for the ref and all this kind of thing.
Kind of links to another question. When you talk about writing or pragmatics of writing, and so far you have shown sort of standard creative writing, if you will, but adverts have some creative aspect to it, and so is catch copies, or even in academic writing there are some creativity. So just wondered if you focus on particularly, say, literary texts or so-called creative writing, are you kind of suggesting there would be a difference in between pragmatics of creative writing and pragmatics of writing academic writing? So I don't know, just
yeah,
I'll ask.
No, that's a really good question, and I mean, my hunch would be that, well, to put it another way, I suppose I'm approaching it from the discipline of creative writing, you know, writing fiction and poetry and so on, partly just because that's what I'm used to doing. So I guess that it's easier for me to think about that, and I guess, but actually I suppose we'd be thinking about all writing processes, wouldn't we, Billy? That actually would say all writing is creative, and in some sense it would have some of these kind of
I'm even more of an extremist than that. I think all human activity is creative. And I think as we're speaking now, this is creative communication. And so for me, it would be more thinking about, is there a difference between the kind of creative writing that is me sending a text to a bunch of academics at Northumbria just before I came to this meeting, and you know, you, Tony, writing poetry, and a copywriter putting together an advert for a film or TV or somewhere. You know, to me, they're all creative, but there's different kinds of things going on.
Yeah.
Okay, please, everybody else, just jump in whenever you like. I did mean it. What I'm going to do for the next bit, so the next section is all kind of one thing, which is talking about George Saunders. So I don't know how many of you know George Saunders, but he writes short stories and novels. He won the Booker Prize for his novel Lincoln in the Bardo a few years ago. And he writes some, I think, quite amazing stories, some of them quite disturbing, but really good. And he came out with this book. It was actually came out this year, didn't it? Early in 2021. called The Swim in the Pond in the Rain. And what he's done in this book is, you see it says there, in which 4 dead Russians give us a masterclass in writing and life. What he's doing is he says, I've been teaching this course on dead Russian writers for like 20 years, I think it is, at Syracuse University in the States. And he loves this course. He really enjoys it. And he's trying to sort of share with readers what it's like to be doing this course with them. So again, some of the next slides are really, Tony's the creator of them, but I'm using some of the ideas. So one thing you get in this book is you get stories. So one of the stories is Chekhov's in the Cart. There's stories by Chekhov, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Gogol. And then you get essays, which are sort of analyzing the text. And after that, you get afterthoughts in which he reflects on the writing process. The very first story, In the Cart, he presents it to you 1 page at a time. And he asks you to read that page and then think about what has been happening so far and talk about it. He describes this as very annoying for the students in his class because they just want to get on with the story, and he keeps stopping them and making them talk about it. But it's very interesting if you're trying to analyze writing. There's a tension between different ways of talking about the stories in the book, which again, Tony picked up on quite quickly. So he talks about that we're hoping to, by doing this, we're going to understand the physics of the form. How does this thing work anyway? So we're turning to these Russian writers to see how they did it. And that seems to suggest there is a physics of the form and that we can look at these things and understand them and see how they work. But he also says things like the actual process is much more mysterious and beautiful and more of a pain in the ass to discuss truthfully. So on the one hand, we're going to act as if there's this thing we can take apart and see how it works. On the other hand, there's a kind of mystery to what on earth is going on here. And of course, that's connecting with the product and process thing again, isn't it?
And can we just go back to the previous slide a sec, Billy? I just want to, so even there in that kind of saying, we're going to look at the physics of the form. So then we're talking about how the story works. So then we're talking about the as if the story is a kind of mechanism, isn't it? That we can just look at that and discover how it works as if it's an engine. But even in that sentence, he then says, we turn to a handful of the great Russian writers to see how they did it, which is suddenly introducing agency, right? It's that idea that in order to understand how this thing works, somehow we're able to read in how it was produced. And so again, even in that, before even we get to the idea of mystery or difficulty, he's kind of moving from the idea of analysis to somehow we're then thinking about what the writer does. So it shows how difficult it is, or how prone we are when we talk about writing to kind of shift between slightly different positions.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so this slide was showing that we focus on the more mysterious side of things. And then these are a bunch of quotes from the book that show you, sounding like things are quite definite. Chekhov has chosen an unhappy woman. Why did Chekhov decide to do this? We're going to see what Chekhov wants us to notice and what he wants to communicate, okay? But then he asks questions like, did he do this intentionally? Was he aware that he was doing it? And says, I think not. The story unfolded naturally, he intuitively. So Saunders thinks that that writers are acting intuitively and, not that analytically and carefully, consciously, but sometimes talks as if they have been quite analytical and deliberate. And another point, he says, we can reduce all of writing to this. We read a line, have a reaction to it, trust, accept that reaction, and do something in response instantaneously by intuition. In my experience, that's the whole game. And the book shows you he doesn't think that's the whole game. But he says at this point that it's the whole game. Just write something, then write something else and be intuitive about it. So I think what we want to highlight there is he's seeing some processes as fairly analytical and deliberate and others as more intuitive and emotional. And one of the things, yeah, go on.
Sorry, but I was just going to say it's worth, that's something that we read pragmatically. So it presents these essays where he's analysing how stories work. And then in the afterthoughts, he says, but we just do things intuitively. We don't actually think about that stuff. And clearly there we're doing some pragmatic reading of it because we know he doesn't really mean that in the way that he's kind of presenting it. Yeah.
I suppose one of the questions that Tony and I are asking is to what extent ideas from pragmatic theories can help with each of these. And I think in our early discussions, the way I presented pragmatics to Tony made him feel like, oh, you won't be able to speak about the intuitive emotional stuff. But my opinion is that pragmatics has changed a fair bit. So it's getting easier to talk about those kinds of things. So this slide, I'm going to skip a little bit quickly, but this slide basically says, you could be pessimistic and say, oh, we're never going to talk about the intuitive emotional stuff. But a more optimistic view would say, well, still there are some inferences. Even if there is intuitive emotional stuff, inferencing is going on in the production and the interpretation. And recent work in pragmatics has thought more about things as less explicit and less conscious and so on. So
just to add the question in the chat about some chat in the chat about translation, and wondering if Saunders is looking at Russian texts in their original or in translation. And so in the book he's talking about in translation, so he says he doesn't speak Russian, and obviously that adds a further layer of complexity in one sense.
Yeah, which he kind of recognizes but puts aside for the purposes of the book.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to skip the next bits quickly because they work better for people that don't know so much about pragmatics as you guys. So, we've moved from maxims with Grice to heuristics in relevance theory, more complexity, more indeterminacy, communication across and beyond interpretations, and so on. I don't need to mention that. I don't need to show you Grice's general pattern, but you know that relevance theory has moved quite far from a sort of explicit reasoning process like this one spelled out here, and more towards this kind of relevance heuristic idea, and recognizing complexity. So, Christoph and Tom gave a talk here in this series in July that really spoke about how incredibly complicated communication is. So I don't know if you want to say something, Tom, or if you're just demonstrating the complexity by.
No, I'm just waving, but I've got nothing particular to say right now.
Thanks. Okay. Oh yeah, and I wanted to show you this slide because it appeared in the talk we gave recently, which was almost the day after at Tom and Christoph's talk. Ryoko demonstrated this by saying, oh, Billy, I see that you've put your camera on, so I'm assuming you've got a question. And that's something that goes on in these kinds of contexts now. We kind of notice that people are about to ask a question because they've switched their camera on or they've made a noise and there's a yellow thing around their image or whatever. Okay, and we recognize more and more indeterminacies about what's communicated, so things like stronger and weaker implicatures, and what is intentional as well. So what I want to end my bit with is picking out a few things. If you went through Saunders and said, okay, where is he saying things that we could relate to pragmatics? And I'm going to mention 2 or 3 with a load of questions about them. I'm not going to do much more than that. But my ears pricked up, or my eyebrows raised or something when I got to reading the bit about the TICHN card, where TICHN stands for things I couldn't help noticing. And I've got a couple of slides with extracts from the book here. So he says, as we read a story, let's imagine, we're dragging along a cart labeled things I couldn't help noticing. As we read, we're noticing surface level type things like Romeo seems to like Juliet, but also things like, oh, there's a lot of alliteration here, or this is being told in reverse chronological order, and so on. And he says, I'm not saying that we're consciously noticing. Often we're not. We're noticing with our bodies and our quality of attention, and may overtly notice, in inverted commas, only afterward as we analyze the story. To me, that leaps out as the kind of thing that pragmaticists talk about. If you're getting something that's a little bit noticeable, you wonder why the communicator's been doing it and what's going to come of it. And he goes on to say, if you closely observe your reading mind, you'll find that as you encounter an excess in a story, some non-normative aspect, you enter into a transactional relationship with the writer. When Kafka writes, Gregor Samsa woke up one morning from unsettling dreams, changed in his bed into a monstrous vermin, you don't say, no, he didn't, Franz, and throw the book across the room. You add, impossible incident, man just turned into bug, to your TICHN card. Then you enter a period of waiting to see. So he talks about noticing something unusual and waiting to see what the writer will make of it, rather than just rejecting it. But I couldn't resist digressing a bit and telling you about Frank Skinner, who at the start of his autobiography gives a counterexample to that, where he says, "I really like true stuff. This is why I never read novels. I'm constantly plagued by the knowledge that they aren't true. If a novel begins, Martin lit a cigarette and considered the situation, I'm thinking to myself, no, he didn't. There is no Martin." So I think he's being partly jokey, but somebody who doesn't read novels for that kind of reason probably would throw the book across the room when this guy turns into a bug. Okay, the other thing I wanted to mention was escalating. So Saunders, I take this as actually giving tips for writers and saying, you want to be a good creative writer, think about this. Always be escalating. That's all a story is really, a continual system of escalation. I don't know how to pronounce that word, is it swath? A swath of prose earns its place in the story to the extent that it contributes to our sense that the story is still escalating. To me, that connects with ideas and pragmatics as well. And it gives this example. You only need to look at the blue bit. A man stood on the roof of a 70-story building. Aren't you already kind of expecting him to jump, fall, or be pushed off? Okay, and then he gives examples of stasis. I went to the store and it was hot in there and I saw Todd. Later, I went to the store and it was hot in there and I saw Todd. Now, I instantly disagree with him when he says that stasis. And I don't know what you all think, but I asked myself, what would a pragmatic theory say about this? And an obvious thing is, what about repetition for effects? If I read a story that says, I went to the store and it was hot in there and I saw Todd, later I went to the store and it was hot in there and I saw Todd, to me, that's in my TICHN card. And I'm thinking, why is it repeated? And I'm expecting there to be a reason that will justify the effort. And of course, relevance theory talks about effects and effort. So if I'm going to the effort of reading about a guy going up to the roof of a 70-story building, something's got to happen because of that. Otherwise, it was wasted effort. I think we could talk about how that works, but it's not as simple as I'm making it sound. I don't think I need to show you that one. So maybe we could talk about escalation having to do with new effects and stasis being when there aren't many new effects from something. But I want to end by thinking about this idea. He says, a man stood on the roof of a 70-story building. Aren't you expecting him to jump, fall, or be pushed off? But then he says, you'll be pleased if the story takes that expectation into account, but not pleased if it addresses it too neatly. And I think what he means there is, on the one hand, if a story goes, a man stood on the roof of a 70-story building and then came down again, you could be a bit disappointed with that story. Or you could think, why did the writer do that? What effect were they going for? But I think equally saying, if all that happens is a man stood on the roof of a 70-story building and then fell off, it still seems a little bit disappointing. And I think that connects with ideas about fiction and reality. Because if I tell you in real life that somebody stood on the top of a tall building there and fell off, that is very much enough. There are lots of effects and so on. But if you're reading a short story and that's what happens, it's kind of like the writer's counting on you to supply all the effects, which is different from the kinds of things you get in more, I don't know, I'm scared to say typical stories because there's such a range of types of stories. So I'm wondering about this idea of taking expectations into account, but not too neatly, and what pragmatic theories can say about this. And I have a few thoughts myself, but I'd kind of like to hear what you all think about it. So I'm just going to stop by saying our next steps are looking more at what writers say about writing, looking at writers' practice and including their reflection on the practice. And then we'll move on to look at teaching practice and reflection on teaching practice. But I want to stop there so that there's a good 20 minutes for discussion. So please say anything you want to say about this.
Thank you.
Otherwise, I'll blather on some more.
Does anyone want to unmute and shout or put their hand up or?
I have a few thoughts. I'll just put one question out to start, if I can. To what extent does anything you've just been talking about depend on literature itself, on words? So a thought that occurred to me as you were going was that I think I might have missed something, but everything you're saying applies just as much to other art forms. Presumably, you think there might be differences, or maybe not.
Actually, no, I don't think. I do think it would apply to other art forms. I suppose there would be differences, but to me, they wouldn't be significant differences.
Yeah,
So
I mean, obviously, yeah. Well, words offer you particular affordances,
yeah,
and so does sculpture, right? And they're different constraints and so on. But maybe that's the relevance generalist, and other people want a more specific focus.
I think that's right. I think the differences would be, if it's fiction, you've got words. If it's music, you've got sequences of sounds. If it's dance, you've got bodies jumping around in space. And those things lead to differences. But in terms of pragmatics, looking for effects and putting in effort, I don't think there's significant differences there. I could be wrong. But
I think Tony wants to say something. I'm curious.
Yeah, I suppose, well, two slightly different thoughts, really. One is, I wonder if there would be a difference between temporal art forms like literature and music and dance and, say, visual art. So if you look at a painting, you can't have it, it can't set up and then confound expectations quite in that way, can it? I mean, I can see that there might be a way that it's playing with our perceptions or our expectations, but it doesn't happen in a kind of sequential way as it would with literature. So, I mean, I'm sure there'll be a way of kind of finessing that, but it does seem a slightly different process.
Yeah, I think what Billy and I would be inclined to say is that I mean, obviously you're completely right that there's a difference there. That is a different constraint / affordance that applies, differently in the different domains.
Okay.
An ultra talented artist would choose between the domains available to them depending on the different affordances and constraints that they enable.
Yeah. And then the other thing I was going to say, which is which we haven't quite mentioned, but Billy mentioned that George Saunders is mainly known as a short story writer, and he's obviously talking about short stories. And I think one of the things that we've noticed, but we haven't quite got to the bottom of, is what he says about expectation and escalation and things must be in there for a reason is clearly particularly applicable to the short story form, where there's a kind of, one of the kind of axioms that a lot of short story writers would say is if something's in there, it has to be in there for a reason. And actually it might be that this is a kind of a particularly apt genre for this kind of idea. Whereas if we're talking about a kind of 12-volume sprawling fancy novel sequence, things might work in a different way at the kind of local, kind of generic level.
and also different genres of stories. So I think what he's talking about has to do with this particular kind of writing practice. So, Chekhov's gun has to go off. But there are other kinds of stories where that doesn't follow, actually.
Yeah. But you would still have this, one of the examples we kind of thought about is Heaney's poem Digging, where it opens with the idea that a pen is like a gun, and the reader at that point has no expectation that the gun will be fired. That's not how poems work. And yet different kinds of expectations are being set up. So I suppose that's just about, depending on the genre and the type of text that we're thinking about, the kind of expectations will work differently, I suppose.
So since one other thing, if I may, while I've got the camera, so to speak, rather than the floor, I don't think Deirdre is on the call. Deirdre Wilson is on the call, but she, in her chapter in the Cave and Wilson book, Reading Beyond the Code, she makes that what I think is a pretty important distinction between comprehension and interpretation. So we comprehend the words and we interpret the text. And in comprehension, things are strongly, meanings are strongly implicated, just like an ordinary conversation. But then, there's actually, when you look at the complexity of human communication, there's all sorts of things that are weakly communicated, and that's something that artists exploit as a matter of course. You didn't say any, I presume you know about that, but you didn't say anything about that comprehension interpretation distinction.
No. The other thing, though, is I am a bit of an extremist on trying to break down some distinctions. And so I would say your everyday conversation the comprehension interpretation thing exists as well.
I would completely agree. I mean, I dare say it's more prevalent in the case of classic literature, but of course it's going to apply to some extent.
I think that distinction is really important, and you might talk about different types of text in terms of the extent to which you go beyond comprehension or are expected to.
I mean, that may well tie back to Tony's point about short stories and multi-volume collections.
Yeah. I mean, the other distinction that I think is relevant, which Kate has written about, so I don't know whether you want to say anything about it, Kate, is the internal external relevance idea. Because I think that's quite relevant to the guy at the top of the building.
Yeah. Are you able to unshare your screen so we can see like everybody? It might be.
Yeah.
A bit more.
There we go.
Yeah. So I was thinking about that. There's the idea that you've got the character internal conversations going on, which you have to interpret by putting yourself in the mental shoes of the character that is being spoken to. But then you've got the relevance of the fact that the author has chosen to show you that scene. And I absolutely think the same would apply to TV and movies, that the director has decided to show you that conversation. And I think in the article I wrote, I was writing about the theatre. They decided to show you that scene. And so, and I was, my thoughts was that I wonder how much of this comes down to that showing idea. So man falls on a roof and falls off and you see him fall. It's going to be relevant to you because you might have to go and help him or phone the police or whatever. But if you see it if you see it happen in a work of fiction, you don't have to do any of those things, but you think, well, but why am I being shown this? What's going to follow from it? And then I was thinking, what about in a journalistic piece where it has actually happened? So it is kind of, but it's not, you're not there witnessing it. So what's the relevance there that something follows from it? So yeah, I think the idea of showing has to come into this somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, the journalism thing makes me think back to the idea of different types of being creative, because you get different types of journalism, don't you? And you get journalism where the point is that it's kind of like prose fiction and that the person's in there, and others where there's a more detached perspective.
And I was also thinking about the idea that it's not just in literature that we get this. So if you've got, I don't know, a politician being interviewed by a journalist, and they probably know exactly what they're going to say, so they're not getting any relevance from each other at that moment, but the relevance is they want to show the answers to the audience, the third-party audience who's watching. It's kind of a performance, even though it's not literary in that sense.
Yeah. That question, why am I being shown this? Just thinking about that from a writerly point of view, I suppose it really makes me think of that experience that I think a lot of writers have, where when you're drafting and you end up with a scene and you kind of think, what's this bit for? And as a writer, you kind of don't know why it's there, but often you have a feeling that it might be important. And I suppose very often part of the writing process there is working out actually what that scene's for, and then you can change it and make it work and so on. But I suppose there's a kind of recognition that it's worth showing, even if you don't yet have the kind of reason for that.
And there's the kind of sort of background showing, you show it's the dark and stormy night, and then there's the kind of, and again I'm thinking about TV or movie, where you focus in on a very particular thing that your attention wouldn't normally, Chekhov's gun, be drawn to, and then you've got more expectation that thing or that object or that person is going to play a part later on, I think.
Yeah.
Whereas the weather might be more about creating an atmosphere and a more general feeling.
Yeah. The things I couldn't help noticing versus the kind of the general kind of establishing of mood and so on, which, yeah.
Also, people vary in terms of how much they notice things, don't they? So, I often miss something that is obvious to other viewers. This is about to happen. And I often miss it till it happens. But some people are really, and it depends on your awareness of genre. There are some things that, yeah.
And then there's that kind of whole genre of thrillers or mysteries where something is there, but you're supposed to see it but not really notice it. and then but when you know who the murderer is or whatever, you can go back and realize it was there all the time for you to pick up on.
There's quite a lot of stylistics researchers these days who look at misdirection and the sort of cognitive tricks that writers play to make you not notice. And magicians is another example.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I was just going to say that also when you're binge watching stuff on Netflix, for example, and because when you're watching like a series and you just watch the whole thing, like 15 episodes in 2 days, you notice things more than if you'd be watching one episode every 2 days or something. And I think, I don't know how much script writers are aware of this, that our expectations would be different when we watch things in that way, as opposed to the normal one episode per day or so.
I hardly ever binge watch, so I haven't noticed that.
Oh yeah, you should try it, because you do notice things that you wouldn't
I hadn't
otherwise.
thought of that. Yeah, I kind of thought I didn't binge watch because I want to be in the interpretation mode for a day or two before I do the next episode and get back to comprehension. But yeah, maybe I'm missing things. I know that people do talk about, now you can skip the intro, so that when you're binge watching, you don't need to watch the intro every single episode. So there's some awareness of those kinds of things for sure.
One thing that I think has happened since the rise of the box set and binge watching is I was rewatching Heroes. I don't know if anyone remembers Heroes from about 10 years ago. And every single episode ends on a cliffhanger, and that was such a familiar trope, that you have the cliffhanger and that makes you wait for next week. But nowadays, if you think of things that have been made more recently, they very rarely have those kind of cliffhangers. And I think that's because the writers are aware of the way that people have consumed them. A cliffhanger has no value if you're just going to go on to the next episode. So yeah, I'm sure that the way that we consume stuff is shaping those kind of writerly decisions.
This is a little bit different, but I've just recently been thinking I'd like to do a study on, when you're watching on YouTube and an advert comes up and it plays for 5 seconds and then you can skip. And I'm wondering how much thought goes into what they get into those 5 seconds in a kind of clickbaity, they've got to make something in those 5 seconds that makes you want to listen on, and almost just at the 5 second mark where you're hovering over the skip button and you go, I clickbait basically, but because they've written on clickbait, I'm wondering if there's something to be analysed there as well, which again is creative writing, isn't it? It's engaging.
Those adverts are very annoying in class. For one, there was a time there when Nigel Farage was popping up at the front of every video I wanted to show my students.
Selling gold, I remember that, yeah. Terrible.
I was wondering though, it may be linked to what Kate was saying. So someone's aware, like how to do this. Someone knows when to stop and so on, what to put into 5 seconds. So how would it be down to talent of each writer or whoever's creating the 5 seconds, or how would you actually teach these pragmatics to writers or anyone?
It'd be interesting to find out. I mean, I suspect it might be, there could be some sort of robotic intelligence thing going on, but it could also be that a lot of that, that alpha beta thing that developers do, where they make 2 versions of something and then they check which one, like, people trying to sell tickets for concerts to kids. They make 2 versions of the site and they see which one makes loads of kids bankrupt themselves by buying tickets and which one doesn't. And then they drop the beta version and they carry on developing in that way. And it might be something like that.
That's definitely how they've developed the clickbait techniques. The CEO of some of those companies has said they test and test and test different versions of the different headlines to see which gets the best click-through rate.
It's a very different process than Chekhov was using.
Yeah.
But is there any sort of not so data-driven way of teaching aspiring writers, for example? Or I'm curious, like whether pragmatics can be actually explicitly taught. And I know there's been some work, and Erika Marset, who presented, was it back in May, is now trying to develop the teaching material in L2 classroom, but in general, how can we teach people to communicate better using relevant theoretic ideas? And maybe the creative writers are one of these cohort who can be.
I've got something to say. I can see Tony's got something to say.
Yeah. So, well, I was just gonna. I mean, thinking really about creative writing and thinking back to what Billy said about what this kind of collaboration that we're involved in might help with. One of my hopes really is that by thinking about pragmatics, that will help writers to think about their writing, and actually it already has, for me, opened up some ways of thinking about teasing out some of the ways that we talk about writing. So it might be just that part of thinking about writing is lots of teaching creative writing is about technical stuff. So talking about, point of view, story structure, all those kind of things that literary critics and maybe stylistics people would be really familiar with. There's also talk about kind of practice, the way that we might arrange our lives and so forth in order to be productive. And it might be that just talking about pragmatics is another way of helping writers to think about, what am I doing when I put something in? Am I playing with expectations and so on? And it might not be a case of kind of sitting down and thinking, right, what expectations shall I set and then subvert today? But illuminating the practice that they already kind of have. That would be my sense of it, that it would become a tool that, as far as I know, no creative writers are really talking about pragmatics, and that seems to be a missed opportunity. Billy, I bet you've got something more succinct and.
No, what I was going to say is I actually have taught writing using pragmatics in the past, where students would have tasks like look at this text, identify an implicature you think readers are likely to make, edit it to make it less likely they will make that implicature. And other tasks where it's like, in a group, you're going to design a document, identify some inferences you want people to make, write it in such a way that you think they're likely to make it. And students found that really useful. And it did change their practice. And it changed their practice in all sorts of things, even like emailing the lecturers. They thought about the inferences that the lecturers would make when they read an email that said, "Hey, Bill," as opposed to, "Dear Billy," or whatever, and all sorts of things. So I think at one level, using ideas from pragmatics is quite simple, and people will benefit from it. But it's more obviously applicable where it's not so much the intuitive, I've just got a feeling this might create loads of implications for somebody reading my story, but it's more like, I want people to use the gym I'm advertising, or, whatever it is that you're trying to get people to take out of the thing that you're writing. Forgive me for being late with my manuscript, or whatever it is.
I'd like to make a comment on what Kate mentioned before about YouTube. These videos with 5 seconds, they require an action. So at that moment, that sticks to your memory. And there's some very good studies by Ecker about memory in advertising, in disinformation. And the only 5 seconds you watch, it still memorizes for you. So it becomes usual. Every other time you see that commercial, that advertisement, you recall and you get a stronger acceptance of the product. So in a way, I think, yes, it works as clickbait, because we always think, it's only 5 seconds, it doesn't matter, it doesn't produce any effects. But because it's being so many times to your memory, you get so used, and then the product becomes more acceptable. And I also would like to add a small comment to that sentence you showed before, taking expectations into account, but not too neatly. I think it relates directly to relevance theory, because in fact, when you're reading, you expect to be dazzled, you expect to change your update your views of the world to be entertained. So he's in a way saying that, yeah, you should not follow the expectations, but by not following that, you're exactly bringing relevance, because what is relevant to the reader is exactly the unexpected, the unusual. So it's what you should take under consideration. So I think it directly refers to relevance theory.
Thank you.
I think, oh, sorry, no, I don't want to keep.
I was going to say, I think jokes work like that as well. Often you're expecting something and then something unusual happens.
I mean, for me, I think that those 5-second things and clickbait need to create what is called an information gap, where you know there's something you want to know, but you don't. So you know that it exists, but you don't know what it is yet. And when I was working on reference for my PhD and for my book, I noticed that happens a lot in the first line of novels as well. So you know, we're taught that you shouldn't use, you know, the first time you introduce somebody, you use an indefinite referring expression, and then you move to definite. But lots of novels start with he was driving across the desert, or they were, the Handmaid's Tale, it's something like that, they were in the gymnasium, and it immediately says, okay, there's something that we already know about it. I called it literary clickbait in my book, actually. But it's that, like, there's something that we're assuming you already know is really relevant here, and you need to stick around and read the rest of this chapter to find out what it is. So I think that's something that you could teach, or at least teach students to notice is writers are doing.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I think I mean, I think literary clickbait is a great term, but in some ways it kind of implies that at that point the author's manipulating the reader or doing something they really wouldn't like. Whereas actually what we know is that readers hate it if you tell them everything. You know, so it's such a common process talking to creative writing students, where you say, stop explaining stuff. You know, the reader doesn't care. We don't mind. So actually it's odd, isn't it?
That feeling. And actually clickbait by
Absolutely.
its definition is kind of disappointing, whereas with the novels or the literature, you want to get that satisfaction in the end, don't you? You want to feel that you get the payoff, whereas you don't with clickbait. That's
Okay,
I
so
think May was waiting to come in just before you stop. Luke, if that's
okay, maybe the last comment then.
Oh,
Sorry, that time is coming.
thanks, Lily. Oh, thanks. Well, yeah, I was just going to mention, speaking of things that you're supposed not to do or do in a particular type of writing, is academic writing. And I'm thinking of that because I'm working right now on a paper on academic writing, specifically on abstracts. I have like a big corpus of abstracts. But it's interesting to see how writers represent themselves in academic writing, because it's a corpus of Arabic academic writing, it's not English. And the expectation of this type of writing is that you don't use the first person. So you don't say, I will do this and I will do that. You should use third person or something, the author, the researcher, whatever. But it's surprising how much this self-representation is manipulated in those academic texts. And you'll find that in the same paragraph, there is the researcher, and then there is I will do this, and then this has been done. It's all in the passive in the same paragraph. It's just crazy. And I don't know how much the authors are actually thinking about what the readers how would they interpret this.
I definitely recognize that from marking essays and looking at students' work, and yeah, those kinds of things happen, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks again for both speakers, Billy and Tony. It was so very interesting, and thank you for everyone for engaging in this very stimulating discussion. And we're so glad that our first one back went so well. We have three more this semester, and then back in January again. We're calling for speakers for next year. This whole three slots this semester has been taken already. So if you're interested in presenting from January onwards, please send us a quick line and we can discuss when and so on. Okay. So thanks again, and see you next month, last Wednesday of each month at 5:30 UK time. Okay. See you
Thank you
soon.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
Ryoko. See you.
Bye-bye.
You'll need to stop the recording, Ryoko, because I'm no longer host.
Okay,
When
so-
you came back in, I stopped being host for some reason.
Okay, yeah. Stop the